Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It's been the big story of 2025. Trump's tariffs on Canada and his threat to annex our country.
And to be honest with you, Canada only works as a state. We don't need anything they have.
But amid all that, a perhaps unlikely voice has emerged on the national stage to push back against the threats from the U.S. president. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who's become a staple on U.S. cable news, offering up a calm, reasoned rebuttal to Trump.
And joining us now, the Ontario Premier, Doug Ford.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, Wolf. We'll never become the 51st state. Canada's not for sale.
Ford's media blitz got the attention of the U.S. president himself and won a key meeting in Washington. I'm Richard Southern, and today on The Big Story, we're speaking with political expert and veteran pollster John Wright about how Doug Ford has emerged as Canada's perhaps unlikely diplomat. Hi, John. Thanks for joining us today on The Big Story.
Great to be with you, Richard.
You know, it's been really interesting to see, obviously, Doug Ford on cable news in the United States, on CNN, on Fox News, and in many ways, he's been Canada's voice pushing back on this tariff issue. So, I mean, I ask you, John, has Doug Ford emerged as kind of an unlikely diplomat here, do you think?
In a way, if you know the premier, the maturity that he's had over the last few years has been to engage oftentimes with adversaries on a diplomatic basis. His background is municipal politics. And when he was in Toronto at City Hall with his brother, he was very combative with a lot of people. One of his first year at Queen's Park was very combative until there was some changes made in the premier's office. But one of the first things he did was he reached out to Chrystia Freeland as the finance minister. He reached out to Dominic LeBlanc, and they developed a really good relationship. So there were liberals that he was talking to and others at that time. And over the course of the last few years, you could see him also reaching out to union leaders and others. In fact, in the last campaign, he was endorsed, I think it was down in Windsor, by a union group that you wouldn't have expected, 5 to 6 years ago being the case. So he's changed from his municipal days. I think he's matured in it. The responsibility he's been given as the chair of the Premier's Council to, carry the water on this has ended up to being a real, an interesting circumstance where he's been able to command a lot of attention, but you can see how he deals with it. He is very clear that this is not about the American public, whatever Canada does. He knows his history. He's speaking respectfully. He talks about being a partner. He talks about the president in firm tones, but in respectful tones. I think if you could ask for a diplomat anywhere to step in, Doug Ford has filled those shoes, and particularly during a time when there really hasn't been anyone else in the country to give that kind of leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I think, having covered Ontario Premier Ford for 7 years in Toronto, I mean, the one thing about him is that he has this ability to speak to everyday people. He's very plain spoken, right? And I think that really resonates with a lot of people. And do you think that resonated on U.S. cable news and maybe with Trump himself, John?
Yeah, it may well have been the case. And especially when they went down to Washington, you have to kind of say, well, what was the end goal? If the end goal was to try and reopen that discussion with the new government that's coming in and to try and open the door with the officials there, then you have to say it was kind of half arrived at. What's been fascinating to all of us who watch politics is that since Mark Carney was made prime minister, he hasn't really had the president calling Canada any names. I mean, he hasn't said anything about Mark Carney. He's off doing other things, dealing with President Putin and, a series of things that are domestic in nature as well. But it was almost daily that you would have had him calling out Canada as the 51st state or Mr. Trudeau as the governor. And it's curious that there's been a vacuum there for the last few days. So whether it's the president himself or whether it's as a result of the meeting that now Finance Minister Champagne went to with Dominic LeBlanc and the Premier, maybe it had some cooling on this rhetoric. And, it remains to be seen how it develops in substance, but maybe it did have that kind of an impact.
Yeah, I want to play a clip here of Doug Ford speaking just yesterday on Tuesday about his trip to Washington, D.C. and his meeting with the Trump Commerce Secretary last week. Maybe trying to reframe that, trying to make it sound like more of a win for him.
We left there knowing what the U.S. wants. And if I didn't do what I did, that meeting would have never happened. I can tell you what they want. They're going to put a global tariff on the whole world. What we're working at is making sure that we're first in line for exemptions.
John, the Ontario Premier threatened an electricity surcharge on the states to get that meeting in Washington last week, but nothing much came of it. Do you think that was a successful get-together for Ford?
I think it may have led to a better understanding between the two parties at what the president may be driving at. I want to reference a New York Times article that appeared on the 18th, on Tuesday, and it really gave a really interesting backgrounder on the tariffs. And it starts off with the automakers who are calling President Trump. And he is absolutely resolute that the tariffs are going to come in, regardless of what the harm is going to be in the short term to the industry. It details his views with people in the White House and in other areas of the legislative branch, to which he's said to be absolutely committed to it because he believes it will be in the best interest of the United States. So what Doug Ford said there goes along with pieces of this article, which says that the tool can be put on and it can be taken off anytime the president wishes. He can use it as a matter of persuasion, or he can put it on and leave it on as a matter of economic policy. And while lots of people in the world, including the three presidents of the car companies who were left gobsmacked and didn't even say anything at the end of what he had said, it may suddenly become clear that the president's not putting tariffs on to bargain, but that the tariffs are in and of themselves an economic tool that he wants to wield across the world, that he believes his own rhetoric about other countries paying the bill. And what Doug Ford is realizing, as he said there, it's a global tariff regime, and they want to be first in line to be exempted. So, keep your powder dry and do things well with the president. Don't irritate him, but let's see if we can make an arrangement where we can be first in line to get some of these things dealt with, but we're going to get whacked. I think that's the case. The president's made it very clear on, that come April 2nd, those tariffs are coming on regardless. And maybe that's what he suddenly came to understand at that meeting.
Do you think that Ford will continue to be kind of Canada's voice on this, or has he, or will he have to cede this now to the feds and our new Prime Minister, Mark Carney? I mean, there's another tariff-focused meeting taking place in Washington later this week, and Ford is not going to be there. I'm told it's just going to be sort of the bureaucrats representing Ontario. Do you think now this is a file that Mark Carney's team is eager to try and take back from Ontario's Premier, John?
No, I don't think so. I think that he's playing it smart. If there are bureaucrats meeting on both sides of the border to talk about reopening the trade package, then what you want to do is not inflame anything any further. You want to let them go ahead and do their nuts and bolts working, and maybe that is the route through. I mean, that's what Premier Ford said before he went out of the gate down to Washington. That's what he said he wanted to achieve, and that was a reopening earlier of the free trade agreement. The Prime Minister said that from the podium in London the other night. That's exactly what he said, that he wants to be respectful and he wants to reopen the entire agreement. He was open to having it move forward sooner rather than later. And so if there is an underlying view amongst Mr. Ford and the new Prime Minister, and maybe some people in Washington, that is the way through to not only renegotiate, but then to change new aspects and put them within that framework, then Mr. Ford's done his job. I think, we could have an election called by the end of this week or the beginning of next week. Many people are pointing towards Sunday now. And if that's the case, we're going to end up with the next 50 days, where there is an election campaign and maybe Mark Carney's the prime minister, dealing with this issue on a day-to-day basis. But Doug Ford's going to continue to be involved in this because Ontario is as large as it is. He's got his hand, in the pot, stirring it down in the United States, that he's got some movement. I don't see him moving off of it, but what I'm hearing in the tone of his voice and the fact that the rhetoric is being toned down, I think it's probably more to wait and see how what has obviously started below the surface continues.
Right. I mean, I don't know that there's ever been a premier of Ontario that has gotten the attention of a U.S.
As you know, there's a very strong man in Canada who said he was going to charge a surcharge or a tariff on electricity coming into our country. He has called and he said he's not going to do it.
What did you make of that, John?
Well, I thought it got the attention, and in many ways, as someone who has been a street fighter, Mr. Ford understands how to deal with a president like that, but he's being respectful. You understand, all the way through, he's being respectful. He hasn't, he's always been very plain and clear what he wants to do. I think there was a bit of a gamble, though, and I will say this, Richard, that if you had shut off the power, and I know there were a lot of people who had said, flick the lights off. Can you imagine if a hospital went out and somebody died in one of the states, or a group of people did? The reaction of the United States towards Ontario, towards the towards Canada, would have been significant. So, I mean, I think he got to the brink and he got the attention. And then I think he stepped back from it, because it may be the case that the United States said, you flick that switch, you're going to have problems. Your own security issues are going to be a problem.
Right.
So I think that, he went as far as he could go, and I think he did the right thing, but I think he's still going to be around to try and nurture the process through, because Ontario is the biggest province and it's the biggest customer of the United States, and I think that's going to be really important.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It was this threat from Ford for Ontario to put a 25% surcharge on the electricity that Ontario sends 3 U.S. states that really got Trump's attention, and that got Ford this meeting in Washington last week. I asked the Ontario Premier yesterday, John, is that electricity tariff or electricity surcharge, is that still on the table? Here's what Ford said.
It's always on the table. The last thing I want to do is antagonize and everyone goes to war again. And I want to try to move forward on any negotiations. That's what I believe in.
Right, so he's trying to put kind of a more positive spin on it right now, do you think?
Yes, but if you let's connect the dots, Richard. I mean, you've had silence on Canada and the 51st state from the president, an uncanny silence for almost a week now. We have a new prime minister who has been very respectful, is aligned with Mr. Ford. We've had the meeting in Washington, at which I think it sounds like they came to an agreement that they'd bring bureaucrats in and start to open the previously negotiated free trade agreement. And if they could get things in that new agreement that the president felt was appropriate, then they could work on that. I think they probably have started that with the bureaucrats going down to Washington. I don't know how long it's going to take. We have an election federally, and obviously whoever wins that election as the prime minister is going to have a huge impact on what's going on, but they're laying the groundwork for it. And what the premier basically said there was, it's on the table, but it's not currently being used. So it's almost like, you've gone to a gunfight, ended up in a saloon, and everybody's put their guns on the table, right? Like everybody, okay, all right, enough of this. Let's just see if we can go to the bar, have a couple of drinks, and then kind of get out of Dodge without getting shot up. I think that's, when you start to piece together the dots, that may be where we're at right now. And it may be encouraging that there is no sniping going on, and that it sounds like there is some movement below the surface.
Yeah, it's a great take. I want to get your thoughts too on how Doug Ford has praised Mark Carney recently. I mean, here's a conservative premier in Ontario, having just won his 3rd mandate, the first time a premier has done that in Ontario in 50 some years. And here he is saying very nice things about this new Liberal prime minister. I don't think Doug Ford has ever mentioned Pierre Poilievre by name. Is there any strategy here by Ford in his praising of Mark Carney, do you think, John?
Well, yeah, I think, again, I go back to what I said at the beginning of this conversation. He reached out to Chrystia Freeland. He reached out to Dominic LeBlanc. He's friends. He would consider Dominic LeBlanc a friend. He goes and spends time in his cottage now in the Maritimes. I mean, he has made personal relationships out of what will potentially be adversaries. And he's done it out of respect because he knows that in order to get things for the province of Ontario, you have to, cajole. You have to be on a wavelength. It's a give and take. So you're not talking about Mr. Poilievre at the moment. When the election is won, we'll figure out what goes from there. But I don't think Doug Ford at this moment sees partisanship as an issue. It's not a bridge that he can't cross. And I think, we've seen over the last number of months, whether it be an election campaign or speaking to Americans, he keeps saying the same thing. I'll work with anybody. I'll do anything. I'll come to the table. I'll have solutions with them. We'll meet. We'll talk. He doesn't say, I'm going to meet and talk with just anybody. He basically means with everybody. So I thought it was prudent. He went to see Mark Carney. I thought it was, it mirrored what then happened when Mr. Carney went to Montreal and met with Premier Legault of Quebec. You got to have relationships with these people. And I think he complimented the new prime minister by basically saying, he's extremely smart about the economy at a time when we need that. I think he did all the right things. And I think he earned some respect and kudos from Mark Carney himself. So, when you take it, Richard, you and I have known Queen's Park for a long time. We've known Doug Ford since he was in municipal politics. When he started in municipal politics with his brother to where he is today, making friends with the opposition, handling tough situations, being pragmatic, some will say flip-flop on some things. Man, oh man, that's a very different individual than we had so many years back, sitting in the chair today and running the province. And he seems to be enjoying it. And maybe that's the fun of the game. That is that you meet and charm your opponent. You try and find some middle ground to work on. You don't call them names. You find, a way to do it. And maybe he's finding that in Washington. He seems to find it across the aisle with politics, except if you're going to run against him. But he seems to be able to do it. And he just seems to be the right guy at the right time in the right room.
It is the evolution of Doug Ford, no question. And, since he has maybe emerged as this unlikely diplomat on the national and even international level, I'll ask you this as the last question, John. Do you think Doug Ford has any federal political ambition here in Canada?
I don't think so. I must say that where I put him is kind of in the Davis category. I mean, Bill Davis didn't speak French. He had the big blue machine, Norman Atkins, campaign manager, and Hugh Segal, his principal secretary, and even John Tory, who we know for today. We're trying to cajole him to become a candidate to run for office. And I mean, you just look at it and say, Quebec is an issue. And if you don't have French and you can't communicate, well, then you're not going to be, a healthy choice. I don't think he has designs on it. Having said that, as long as people can think that you are at that level or aspire to it, maybe you have a little more royal jelly in the room every time you walk in to discuss something, and that will be very helpful. But I don't, if he's harboring views, he hasn't put it out. If he's got designs on it, the first thing you'll know is that he's talking more with the new lieutenant governor who speaks fluent French. If he's taking French lessons from her, well, then I'd say there's something up.
Great take. John Wright, veteran pollster, political expert. We appreciate you, John. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure, Richard. Take care.
That was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. And you can find us on the Seeker app or on all your local favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. Thanks for listening.